Good evening, and welcome into the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Alyssa Gaines. I'm a junior at the college studying social studies in the history of art and architecture, and I'm a member of the JFK Junior Forum. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the Park Street side and the JFK Street side. In the event of an emergency, please walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Junior Kyle Davis to the stage.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the JFK Junior Forum. My name is Kyle Davis, and I'm a first year at the college planning to study government and neuroscience. It is my distinct honor to introduce our panelists tonight, who will be discussing topics extremely relevant to the legacy of this administration: how America's infrastructure and transportation revitalization will impact communities around the country, and what challenges lie ahead for the next 4 years and beyond. Our guest tonight is Pete Buttigieg, the nation's 19th Secretary of Transportation under the Biden-Harris administration. Growing up in South Bend, Indiana, Secretary Buttigieg received his undergraduate degree from the college in 2004 and went on to earn a Rhodes Scholarship, graduating from Oxford with a degree in philosophy, politics, and economics in 2007. After choosing to serve in the military, he successfully ran to be mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and as Secretary of Transportation, he has worked to streamline operations and focus on the department's 5 policy goals. To tackle the extreme challenges that COVID has placed on the American economy and transportation infrastructure, he has worked to support American supply chains by maintaining existing infrastructure, diversifying methods of transport, and advancing transportation in more efficient and sustainable ways. The conversation will be moderated by Setti Warren, Director of the Institute of Politics, and adjunct lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. He previously served as mayor of Newton, Massachusetts from 2010 to 2018 and was the first African American to be a popularly elected mayor in Massachusetts. Warren has had an extensive career in public service, serving as special assistant in the White House Office of Cabinet Affairs for President Bill Clinton, as New England director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and as deputy state director for Senator John F. Kerry. Prior to running for mayor, Warren completed a year-long duty in Iraq as a Navy intelligence specialist. Please join me in welcoming our speakers to the stage.
I was just a little worried that, we could have people would show up tonight. I was really concerned about that, but they did. They did for you. Welcome home.
Thank you,
Mr. Secretary.
Kind of emotional to be back.
Before we get started, just a few things. I want to welcome C-SPAN to our audience this evening. And before we begin, I want to emphasize the fact that the IOP takes great pride that we are a nonpartisan organization. From my standpoint and our standpoint, it's important for us to hear different views, even if we disagree. It's one of the reasons why we had the governor of Arizona here last month, Doug Ducey, who sat right here. Now we have you here, Mr. Secretary, which is important. So let's get started. Before we do, this is an event in your official capacity tonight, so I assume there aren't going to be any breaking news announcements, right? Because you're in your official.
Yeah. Keep me out of trouble. I can't, awkwardly or conveniently, depending how you look at it, I can't talk about party politics, elections, campaigns, while I'm in this role. So of the 3, the personal, the political, and the policy, I can do 2 out of 3, and I'm happy to talk anything personal, anything policy, but I'm going to refrain from contributing to the takes on campaigns and elections.
We'll take the 2 out of 3. So let's get started. There's a lot of reporting post-election about the fact that a lot of people voted regarding their own financial condition, the economic conditions in various communities. I know the Biden administration really invested trillions of dollars in the CHIPS Act, manufacturing, clean energy, and the like. My question to you is, one, how do you see that working? I know you spoke a lot about the Midwest and other parts of the country. How do you see that working? And it also seems as though folks aren't hearing the progress that has been made and the actual investments that have been made. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so first of all, I think we have to acknowledge that people have been through a lot economically. And when I was a student here, or really my entire adult life until recently, the economy and jobs was the same thing. People even say jobs and the economy and jobs. And if there were a lot of jobs, then the economy was great. And if there weren't a lot of jobs, then the economy was in trouble. And by the way, something that thankfully has not been experienced in many years is something that wasn't experienced when you and I were mayors, which is high unemployment.
Right.
When I took office in South Bend, Indiana, the unemployment in our county was north of 10%.
What year was that? When were you?
2012, I came.
2012,
So we were still digging out of the Great Recession.
Yep.
But now the economy isn't just jobs, it's prices.
Right.
And if the measure of jobs looks good, but prices hasn't, people feel that. And even when prices looks good, if interest rates and the price of housing, which doesn't really show up in the same way in CPI, it doesn't feel good, that's real. So your question of how are things working, I mean, the honest answer is slowly. Now, I would argue we've made enormous progress. The next president is going to inherit an economy that's at basically full employment, inflation in the neighborhood of 2%, but only after this terrible bout of post-COVID inflation that everybody's been through. Interest rates that are higher than they've been for most of my adult lifetime, but in the bigger kind of multi-decade sweep of things would be more kind of in the middle of that range. But so many of the economic benefits of what we've been working on in my world is things that take years to get done. So there are some things that the administration achieved that are wildly important, like the child tax credit, that cut child poverty almost in half. Congressional Republicans blocked us from extending it, but it was a huge achievement that happened almost overnight. Getting insulin down to $35 for seniors, and congressional Republicans blocked us from doing that for every American, but we got it for seniors. That happened overnight. But in the space of the things that I get to work on, some of the projects we're doing, the Alston project right across the river.
Yep.
I'm really excited that we have the funding now. We have parts of that grant agreement already done. But if we could work at warp speed, then that'll happen in a few years, right? And so a lot of the benefit is yet to come. Same thing on the EV factories that are going up around the country. And this is very personal for me because I grew up in South Bend, Indiana. People know it for Notre Dame. Notre Dame's actually outside of city limits. When I took office, our per capita income was about $19,000 per person. And our economy was defined less by the university than by auto manufacturing. Studebaker stopped making cars in 1963. And when I became mayor 50 years later, our community was still licking its wounds from that. I didn't even know that it was unusual to have acres of collapsing factories around you on your way to school until I came here to go to college. And the reason I raised that is because even though there hadn't been much growth in auto manufacturing where I come from since Studebaker closed its doors in 1963, there was one really big project, a steel plant in 1990, about $1 billion. Right now, there is a project 4 times that big with GM and a joint venture making EV batteries in St. Joe County, close to where I grew up. But it's not open yet. It's not going to be open for a little while. I imagine that one of 2 things will happen for the next administration. Either they will inherit a lot of groundwork that has been laid, and I'm trying not to sound bitter about this, but jobs that were always expected to come online in 2025, 26, 27. Just as we finally fought inflation back down from 9% to 2%, partly, by the way, by untangling supply chains post-COVID. And the building trades has a pipeline of work that they've not seen, certainly since before I was born. And interest rates seem to be ticking down. And will not hesitate to take credit for a lot of that, assuming they keep it going. Or something else could happen, right? A more extreme economic policy profoundly disrupts our supply chain through mass deportations, introduces trade wars that complicate our ability to grow our economy and send our economy in a very different direction. Possibly one where, once again, the biggest thing we have to worry about is jobs. And I think it's been a while since that's been something we've had to worry about. All of which is to say, if we haven't solved somebody's economic problems, then we've got more work to do. If we've done good work for somebody, but they don't, and they feel like they're personally doing okay, but they don't feel like the national economy is doing okay, that's a different set of challenges. That's an information challenge. And we got to be real about both. The extent to which many people truly are experiencing economic pain right now, and they're upset with the administration over it. Yep. And then others who would say that their own personal economic circumstances are pretty good, but are among the surprisingly high number of people who tell pollsters that they believe that unemployment is at an all-time high today, when that's almost the opposite of what's true.
I want to sort of move to some specific issues that you dealt with, some challenges, part of which I know is the aviation industry. Coming out of COVID, there were a lot of consumer complaints about delays, cancellations, and the like, just basic customer service. Can you tell us what kind of interventions you provided and give us an update on that? Where are we?
So in brief, we have set about the biggest expansion of passenger protections since the department was created in this modern form. And I'm really proud of that work. We've got a dashboard up. Now, dashboard doesn't sound like much, but because we told the airlines that we were doing the dashboard, which would say what all of their passenger protections were, with remarkable speed, right after I sent them a letter saying, hey, we're going to put all this information online, they changed their customer service policies before we even had to write a rule. But we still wrote the rule. It just takes a while in order to do a regulation. So we did a 1-2 punch, where first we used transparency to drive change. Then we backed it up with regulation to require those changes. And now we have things that are the letter of the law, like automatic refunds, so that if you get canceled, you don't have to fight the airline to get your money back. It will just come. That not only helps relieve you as a consumer of that burden, but relieves our department of the work of chasing down a refund if you have to get so frustrated you complain to us. And it actually changes the economics of the airlines, considering, for example, unrealistic schedules. Because if you know for a fact automatically that if you have a canceled flight, everybody's going to get their money back.
Right.
You're much less incentivized to even consider allowing that cancellation to happen if it's under your control. We have stepped up enforcement. When I was first reviewing the enforcement actions we were contemplating against airlines that held out on customers for hundreds of millions of dollars in refunds, we'd find sometimes an airline might owe people $100 million, and we were fining them $1 million a year later for that. Which, if you think about interest rates, they're actually up on the deal, right? It's like a low-interest loan to them. So they were incentivized to do the wrong thing. So we added a zero, actually 2. The Southwest airline action was $135 million. It was a multiple of all of the fines levied against airlines combined in the decades before we got there. We're doing these things not because we're out to be, it's not because of anything against the airlines exactly, but it's because we need them to deliver better service. The last thing I'll mention that doesn't get enough attention is the experience of passengers with disabilities using airlines. Many passengers have resorted to dehydrating themselves because they cannot access a lavatory on board. We have put forward a rule that's going to change that. And many passengers experience their wheelchair being mangled or destroyed or mishandled by an airline, which you just think about it, especially because, different people need different, often sometimes very customized wheelchairs. If they screw up your wheelchair, that doesn't just ruin your trip. That ruins your life until you get your chair fixed. Right. And it was taking weeks or even months to do that. So we have a new framework for the handling of wheelchairs. So these are some of the things we've done to protect passengers from as consumers, which is the second most important thing in aviation. The most important thing, of course, is safety. Yeah. And this is something that I wish we were as serious as a country about on the surface side as we are in aviation. I think most people here remember the news around the Alaska Airlines door plug blowing out, right? That was an international story. It had us rethinking our entire oversight framework. because somebody could have gotten hurt. Meanwhile, and rightly so, by the way. Meanwhile, since you and I sat here, somebody died on America's roadways, and it's not news. We lose more than 100 people a day on our roadways. I'm convinced that if we can have, in a typical year, 0 fatalities, in a form of transportation that involves being propelled through the air, miles above the surface of the ground, by the way, propelled by igniting flammable liquids, right, and going nearly at the speed of sound, then we should be able to get closer to 0 in forms of transportation that are moving on the surface. And that's exactly what we set out to do with our roadway safety strategy.
Sounds like you and I, years ago when we were mayors, used to talk about basic on-the-ground improvements using transparency, accountability, data.
Yeah.
Sounds like you've infused that in the Department of Transportation when you're thinking about aviation, road safety, and things like that.
Absolutely. Look, I know that the fascination with data can go too far because it can lure you into confusing a moral problem with a technical one. And I think as elected officials, or appointed officials, we earn our paychecks most in contending with moral problems. But there really are, in the vocabulary that I was once upon a time taught here, there really are Pareto gains to be made out there. There really are, in fact, ways to make somebody better off without making somebody else worse off.
Right.
But you need to use data and transparency to try to find those ways. Right. And that's a big part of what we try to do at the department. The other reason I really believe in data and transparency about ourselves and open data about government, which is, I know, a big topic in city governments when you and I were serving at that level, is that it helps make sure that when you have a debate, it's over something real. Like, I'd rather be beat up over a deficiency in our work that's actually happening than one that people just made up. Yeah. And the more you put your data out there for everybody to see, the more the rough and tumble of policy and politics is over a reality instead of just a fight to create your own reality, which maybe we'll talk about more, but I think is one of the biggest things at stake in our politics and policy.
Well, just staying on that, you wrote this book about trust in America. And your proposition is that we have to build social trust in our community, in our society. We know institutions, the trust in institutions have gone down quite dramatically in the last years. So could you actually talk about how trust could actually help us solve some of the biggest social challenges that we have, economic challenges we have? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. Look, I think that if you're our age or any younger.
I like how he said our age.
Give or take. You're a millennial, right? Can I claim you as a millennial?
Yeah, probably.
Close enough.
But let's go with it tonight. Let's do it.
Oh, grandfather you in.
That's I'm on it. I'm good.
My first election that I voted in was 2000. I was a student here. I was a freshman. Most of what people my age and younger witnessed since then was policy failure. Up until, I would argue, the last few years. There are a few big exceptions, the best of them being, from the Obama years, being the Affordable Care Act. Mm-hmm. And then I would say we finally delivered on infrastructure, we finally delivered on reinvesting in the industrial Midwest, and we finally delivered meaningful climate legislation. But through that time, we had the Iraq War, which is the formative experience of my college years, the Great Recession, which was the formative experience of the time I entered the workforce, and the rise of Trump populism, COVID, and then the post-COVID economy. Anytime there's a policy failure, it erodes trust. And what's really perverse about that is when social and political trust are eroded, it becomes harder to do things. Mm-hmm. Which means more policy failures are likely. Now, there's a corresponding virtuous cycle that can happen, which is if you solve some problems, you win just enough political capital to try to solve a bigger problem, and over time, you build trust. I would say, whether we said it out loud or not, the implicit working theory of our administration has been that if we could just deliver on the basics, like roads and bridges, and airports and ports, and fighting to get inflation back down and other cost of living issues like the cost of insulin. And all of the other things that we've been working on that are very basic, unsexy, but important. Safe drinking water. Then if we're going to have this, if we're going to be, as a country, like two people locked in a wrestling match on the edge of a cliff, solving some of those basic problems or making progress on them would move our wrestling match a few feet further away from the edge of the cliff. I think that's what we set out to do. But as everybody has noticed, we don't seem to be that much further away from the edge of the cliff.
I want to just stay on this. What is the pathway forward? It sounds like what you're saying is make sure you do policy, do it well, make a difference, and that begins to build trust back, at least in institutions. Is that what the theory of the case is? I mean, is that the basic?
Well, it's part of it. Yeah, you got to deliver, right?
Okay.
And I want to make sure that we strip away some of the cosmic themes and the extraneous themes that have been introduced into our public and political life and just talk about actually solving basic problems. Because my experience as mayor, where I had equal approval ratings from Republicans, Independents, and Democrats, and not because I ever pretended to be more politically conservative than I was. It was because we focused on stuff like dealing with the vacant and abandoned houses in our neighborhoods and getting everybody clean, safe drinking water and bringing back our economy and just basic things that people knew they needed. And I think the most important thing in politics is that it pay attention to everyday life. I think a politics of the everyday is something we need to get back to. I experience it in a whole new way now that I have a family, knowing that the existence of my family depends on a margin of one justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. So it doesn't take long when I'm heating up the chicken nuggets for our kids to have it hit me that like politics is in my kitchen. And that's true for everybody socially, economically, in so many other ways. But people have to actually see it get better. Obviously, in that particular sense, my rights and freedoms got much better in 10 years. But in a lot of other ways, it has been at best 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. But I have to think a big part of our way out of all of this that we're in right now is to deliver on those basics. And obviously that's what I try to do all day in my job.
One last part to this I just want to cover. You obviously have to work with people you disagree with. You have to work across the aisle. You had Republicans in South Bend. You had citizens you represented. How do you think about that now in this really difficult, polarizing environment? Working across the aisle, get things done.
I know this is on folks' minds here too. Let me begin by saying I have the advantage of working on things that are relatively can be relatively nonpartisan, right? They should be, right? Like the only thing that ought to be controversial about building better, generically building better transportation infrastructure, can you still hear me? Yeah, okay. Is how good of a job we're doing at it. There's even a saying, there's no such thing as a Republican way to fill a hole in the road or a Democratic way to pick up trash, right? That's a motto among mayors.
Yep.
I mean, we would go to U.S. Conference of Mayors stuff. I would get to know people. I'd become friends with them and literally not even know what party they were in.
Yeah,
it didn't come up.
Yeah.
And again, it's not that we pretend it all to be ideologically centrist.
Right.
It's that the things that we were concerned about were following the lead of the voters who sent us there. We're trying to get stuff done. That's what we do every day. Now, I would argue that not only is aviation safety something that ought to be a nonpartisan concern, but I would also argue reconnecting communities should be a nonpartisan concern. This has become controversial, but in my view, if a road was used to segregate a city, and the city comes to us saying we want to do something about that road, connecting through or over or around that road, or maybe even removing it and replacing it so that the city's less segregated, shouldn't be controversial. Turns out, it can be. Same thing with climate. In most developed countries, there is not a debate over whether climate change is a problem. There is a debate over who's better at dealing with it. We have not reached that level at the United States in our politics. I experienced this testifying in Congress, where I had a member of Congress say to me that it was the changing of the seasons, that winter, fall, that was climate change. And it was one of those moments when you think to yourself, this is not a high school model Congress. This is the actual, this is the actual United States Congress that writes laws that we all have to live by, right? But I want to get to a world where the big debate between congressional Democrats and congressional Republicans is over who's doing a better job of tackling climate change, not whether it's real. I will say this. A lot of people laughed at Joe Biden when he said, we're going to come in and we're going to do big things in a bipartisan way. And by the way, it's easy to forget, now that this infrastructure bill is up and running, that the political obituary of that legislation was written half a dozen times across 2021. The idea that we could do it at all, let alone the idea we could do it on a bipartisan basis, was laughed at. And we did it. Mitch McConnell was for it, and he's not for a lot. We got it done. And that, to me, signals that it is, in fact, possible to work across the aisle. Now, that's my policy part. Since there are a lot of people here who will or hope to be involved in politics and public policy, let me migrate from the policy side to the personal side, while still doing my best to stay out of the partisan side. If you choose to engage in public life in any fashion, you're going to be breaking bread with people who will align with you on some things and in other ways say or believe or do things that horrify you. I literally had the experience of having a wonderful, pleasant meal with a member of Congress who gave me a gift for my children. And that same day, went into the United States Capitol and voted against marriage equality. That takes some real compartmentalization. Because this member of Congress is actually a pretty good partner on getting certain important transportation things done. I don't have an easy way to tell you how to do that compartmentalization other than two observations. One, you will benefit from being at a university in that environment that values the exposure and collision sometimes of different ideas and commitments. Because you will discover that somebody who holds a view that you despise is not a person that you despise. They're just a person who holds a view that you can't get your head around or that you can't imagine how is justified. And maybe you'll convince each other of things and maybe you won't. But the point is, like, you will have, in the way that when you're a mayor, you can't shut down the city government because you disagree on stuff, because you deliver water and you need water to live, right? You just figure it out as humans. And then when you find yourself in public life, those instincts will serve you well in trying to recognize that people come to their views honestly. Well, it gets a little different in public life, but right now, most of the people around you, that's the virtue of being younger. Is most young people believe what they believe, not because they need to get reelected, but because that's just what they believe. That matters. That sincerity of thought matters. The challenge that comes with that matters. That's my first observation. My second observation is part of what helps you compartmentalize in those moments is to remember that it's not about you. The whole point of public service is that it's not about you. And so while you as a person might be pissed off about how another person is standing in your way in a political objective, your function is not to impose your personal preferences on the world. Your function is to serve others. And sometimes serving others means working with really difficult characters, either in terms of their personality or in terms of their ideology. That's how stuff gets done, right?
Absolutely.
And so, sorry, you got me going, but
No. Once a mayor, always a mayor.
obviously, at the moment that we're contemplating, I think a lot about this because I had hoped that we would be going into an era where we had something of a more normal dynamic among the two political parties, and I don't think that's what's about to happen, to put it mildly. But I'll also say this is the last thing I'll say. Being nonpartisan or bipartisan is not the same thing as being neutral. And if there are certain things that are red lines, like believing in democracy or supporting the Constitution, you can hold to those red lines and still disagree all day about fiscal policy, social policy, what the butter subsidy ought to be. There are spaces that you will decide to work within and spaces that you will decide you cannot tread in. And I think that's going to be an important thing for us all to hold in mind at any institution and certainly in public life over the next few years.
I think that's a really important point that you made as people are considering their own personal decision around politics. I want to shift to policy, back to policy. You traveled to Ukraine about a year ago. I believe it was around recovery, infrastructure, things of that nature. Typically, we don't really think of secretaries of transportation traveling abroad into a war zone. Can you talk a little bit about that mission, what you were trying to do? Did you accomplish what you wanted? Why was it important for the United States for you to be there?
Yeah, so early on, we formed a partnership with my counterparts in Ukraine soon after the full-scale invasion. And what we found is, first of all, I really admired the work that they were doing, because in Ukraine, they are working on 3 different levels of infrastructure. First, they just have to maintain it the same way we do, right? Just because there's a war on doesn't mean it's any less important to plow the snow. If anything, it's a little more important because your supply lines are at stake. So they have to plow snow. They have to put together infrastructure that's being blown up. So there's battle damage recovery. And what's really inspiring is even as they're doing those 2 levels of thinking and work, they're thinking about a 3rd level, which is what does the future look like? All the way down to questions of how to take supply chains that in the Soviet era were really aligned around getting to Russia and back and reorient them to getting to the rest of Europe and back, all the way down to things like the gauge of their tracks. So I don't know if there are any fellow railroad nerds here, but a Soviet railroad track is slightly wider than a Western railroad track. Things you don't think about until it's your job. Resetting the standard that your railroads operate on is no small thing, right? On all kinds of different areas, we've been partnering with Ukraine, and had a great meeting with President Zelensky, and kept in touch with my counterparts kind of before, during, and since that visit. And it was inspiring. It was a good reminder as I was tearing my hair out over delivery challenges on bridge building in the U.S., that they were contending with a whole different level of challenge and doing it with as much innovation as I've seen anywhere. The international transportation is, of course, a domestic agency, but the international component of it is underappreciated. Whether we're talking about open skies agreements, whether we're talking about those kinds of partnerships, or whether we're talking about the fact that transportation is, of course, by its nature about going different places, and synchronizing a global transportation system is a massively complicated, difficult, and sensitive undertaking that's only going to become more so as we deal with things like uncrewed aerial vehicles entering into the airspaces, or the role of AI, or any number of other things that are going to be just manifestly transnational challenges. So the international work has been among the most rewarding pieces of doing transportation. And of course, it's also interesting to learn from your counterparts and see what they're doing. My German counterpart, for example, is undertaking an effort to do a major overhaul of their railroad network, and made the difficult decision that in order to deliver the project much more quickly and cheaply than would otherwise be possible, they're just going to take whole sections of their railroad network offline for about 5 months. I don't think that would be tolerated in the U.S. But I have to say, if it were, it would actually radically change the delivery timelines for things like the work we're doing on the Northeast corridor that could get you from here to New York or D.C. a lot more quickly. And it'll be very interesting to see what they learn. So I think in any job, even as mayor, I like learning from counterparts abroad. It's certainly true when it comes to transportation.
That's great. I've got one more for you, but before we do that, if folks want to ask questions, there are 2 microphones on the floor. There's one in each loge box. When you come to the mic, please identify yourself, your Harvard affiliation, and please end your question with a question mark. So I got one last question for you. I saw some great video of you in the forum here.
Oh, no.
We talked about this, and I think it was 04, 03 presidential, 04 presidential campaign. You challenged Congressman Gephardt with some really difficult questions. There's a lot of people here, a number of people here that I know are thinking about running for office, thinking about going into public life. They're in the seat you were 20 years ago. You know, we live in this really polarized world, as we've discussed. There's political violence, there are political dangers. Some people have come into my office here and have said, I don't know if I can do this because I don't want to put myself in harm's way. I don't want to put my family in harm's way. So what's the advice you would give to people aspiring to do this in general, but then also thinking through the real challenges in getting into politics these days?
Well, first of all, there's nothing more rewarding than public service. It forces you to extend yourself to other people in a way that just grows you. And I think for a lot of people, it's difficult to describe how rewarding that is, but it's worthy. Second thing I'll say is you don't have to have a political, quote unquote, personality to be in politics, including running for office. I think this is really important to remember because when I was here, Bill Clinton was president. And he had certain qualities that they seemed absolutely magical if you were coming at it from the perspective of like a, kind of socially awkward, intellectual, it turns out closeted kid from Indiana. Because he had famously the power to just make people like him just by meeting them. And I imagined that in order to be in public life, you had to be like that. You had to be charismatic, backslapping, huge extrovert, memorize people's names after 2 seconds of meeting them, tall. There's a lot of things that I didn't think I was. It turns out that's not what running for office is. It can, it probably helps in many ways to be extroverted if you're going to go run for office. But my first run for office, I ran for state treasurer of Indiana, and there's a long story as to why. But it meant going around to every chicken dinner in Indiana, and nobody had heard of me or the office I was running for, sticking my hand out to total strangers, interrupting their chicken dinners to tell them why they ought to vote for me for treasurer. I did not win. But I learned so much doing that and have ever since. Of course it comes at a cost. Anything worth doing comes at a cost. But look, especially when you're a student, you are, I hope, reared on stories of extraordinary political courage. So many people have given everything, whether it's as an actual political candidate. Matter of fact, I was thinking about it. I made pocket money as a photographer here at the IOP in the Forum. And I remember taking pictures of Ted Kennedy when he spoke here. And I took pictures of a Croatian politician who was assassinated soon after he spoke here at Harvard. I was stunned because I saw the news story, and it was a picture that I took as a student. If it's worth doing, then it's worth doing. But you can't just wave away the cost. I think the most important thing to hold in mind is that somebody's going to be doing this. So if you trust in your own integrity, then you have to trust that you're going to be doing it for the right reasons, that you wouldn't do it lightly. And it's more worth doing if it isn't going to be easy. Very few people here face the kinds of dangers that faced a politician from the former Yugoslavia in the early 2000s. But, I think it's not overly dramatic for people in this political moment to wonder what's ahead if you choose to get involved in public life. To know, at least in terms of your ease of living and probably your income, always your income, if it wouldn't be easier to just do something a little less politically sensitive. But remember, once again, the people we send into city halls and state capitals and Washington, D.C. have power over our lives. And if you're not part of that process, you're still subject to it. So who do you want there? You? Or somebody you know and believe in and are willing to take a risk to support them? Or anybody? Sorry, one more thing, because this is a place of enormous privilege. So I guess the other thing I would add is, and look, at a different level, I felt this just through the privilege of being a U.S. citizen, which is part of what propelled me into the military, as I know it did you. But especially the privilege of what's being invested in you here, whether you're here being funded with money from other people to make sure you get an education, or whether you're not, but you're still benefiting from the incredible institution and the institutional resources of this place at the expense of anybody else who could have been in the seat that you're in. There's another side to that equation. Like, you kind of owe the world something now to have accepted the privilege that comes with being in an institution like this. Some personal sacrifice might be part of how you settle that account.
Great, thank you. And the last time
Sorry, I'm in kind of a weird mood right now. I think we all are. I think we're all getting through this together.
This is great.
But I know it's a heavy time. I also know that not everybody came here to hear about transportation. I will do my best to color within the lines of the Hatch Act, but I really have been looking forward to the discussion, and I'll do my best to answer your questions as honestly and candidly as I can.
That's great. Just one last point. I worked for Bill Clinton. The last time I checked, he does not or did not speak 7 languages fluently. And you do?
I wouldn't say fluently.
Okay. All right, let's go over here.
Hello, Secretary. My name is Clive Lawrence. I'm a student at the college. I care a lot about mobility justice, which is a vision where all people feel safe using our streets, can do so with dignity. To me, infrastructure means addressing justice and fairness and equity. Yeah. So I'm thinking about a lot of the history and challenges that communities face where they suffered from a lack of investment or even disinvestment. I'm wondering, how can we ensure that mobility justice, fairness, equity in our transportation systems are a national priority, both in this past administration and moving forward?
So in this present administration, if I may, at least for 10 more weeks, we're working very hard on this, and we have been from day one. By the way, you're fortunate to have here at the Kennedy School my predecessor, Secretary Anthony Fox, who blazed a trail on a lot of this, and avail yourself of any opportunities to learn from him if you can, because this is real. Look. So many, let me just point to a couple, we could do an hour on this. Let me point to a couple of examples that are on my mind. One thing that haunts me is I went to Chicago and met with people from a community called Roseland. Roseland is a neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. It's in the city limits of Chicago, but it's far south side, not served by very fast public transportation. If you live in that neighborhood, especially if you live in the housing development of Altgeld Gardens, it takes you almost an hour and a half, if you don't have a car, to get to the Loop in downtown where most of the jobs are. That really struck me because there is a community by the same name, except they pronounce it Roseland, in Indiana, close to South Bend, where I grew up, 90 miles away. And if you do have a car, it takes about an hour and a half to get to the Loop in downtown Chicago. And that just crystallized for me what's at stake in making sure people have better transit and why it matters that we're now extending the red line to the south side of Chicago with federal funds. Access to transit. Safe, just basic, unsexy things like sidewalks, crosswalks, lighting, and the ability to move back and forth in your own community are not something that different communities have experienced in an equal way. And most of the patterns of exclusion that apply to a whole bunch of other areas of our life, including regional, economic, and racial, clearly apply to what's happened with transportation. You mentioned places that have experienced a lack of investment or disinvestment. I would add a third, which is when investment arrived, but it was done to people instead of with them. In Detroit, there were 2 neighborhoods, Paradise Valley and Black Bottom, really energetic, thriving, majority black neighborhoods. When I-375 was built, it went like a gash right through them, just cut them in 2. Right now, with federal funds, we are improving, not just improving, there's going to be a boulevard instead of a cut. And it will add value instead of destroying value in the neighborhood. And the cars will still come and go. The cars will be just fine. These are the kinds of things that, again, somehow they become politically controversial, but they make everybody, no one's worse off because we did this. Now, some people are healed in a greater degree. Their neighborhoods are healed. I could go on and on. The Chinatown project in Philly, and 100 small projects that won't make national news. But whole communities are lifted up when we stitch them together. I don't know what the next administration will do. I hope, though, that one thing that still matters is local voices. We're doing over 63,000 projects so far that are funded through the infrastructure law. And what all of them have in common is 0 out of that 63,000 were invented in the US DOT headquarters in Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. All of them came to us because a state or a city or a tribe or an airport authority or the T or somebody wanted to get it done. And we had to do some picking and choosing on the discretionary grants, but they came to us with ideas. And that, I hope, is what remains, because principled conservatism has some regard for the local. If anything, principled conservatives sometimes have shown more regard for the local than the left. I don't know what this next administration will do, but I'm hopeful that that principle will survive and help to animate further support for projects to deliver more just and fair transportation patterns.
Thanks. Go over here.
Hi, Secretary. Thank you for speaking with us. My name is Ethan Morales. I'm a 3L at the law school. It's also an honor because my first political experience was running the UC Berkeley chapter of your primary campaign in 2020.
Well, thank you.
I apologize for not doing enough. My question is about local governance. Blue states have a lot of policy successes. They're the innovation and cultural capitals of the nation, and they outcompete red states on a lot of metrics. Yeah. But urban deep blue areas shifted right more than any other geographical subset in this last election. And when you look at places where Democrats have trifectas and supermajorities, places like my home state of California, it's hard to ignore some visible problems of urban disorder or cost of living, housing supply constraints, and above all, state capacity, especially in areas like transportation, which makes it hard to do the liberal promise pitch, which is that we can effectively solve problems collectively. Yeah. So my question is, in the next 4 years, when local and state government is all that we have, what are some policy solutions that we can begin to work on to repair these problems and indirectly the reputation of the Democratic Party?
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised this. And again, if it sounds like I'm tiptoeing, it's just to stay clean on staying out of partisan talk. But one thing I believe, and I've been reflecting on it a lot in the last week, and I say this, I did not come here to add to the pile of takes that are out there. There are plenty of takes. There's some really good ones, like John Della Volpe's recent piece. There's some half-assed ones. I'm not here to offer a take. But one thing I believe, and I believed it in 2017, I wrote it in 2017, and I still think it's true, is that in moments like this, our salvation really will come from the local and the state levels. Something that, again, sometimes Democrats have lamented, right? Our federalism, like we kind of would like a little more consistency at the federal level. But a lot of the answers are going to come from mayors, from communities, from states that aren't captive to some wacky ideological project. They're just focused on getting things done. Now, embedded in your question is the fact that we haven't always, those of us left of center, haven't always covered ourselves in glory when we've been given a free hand to get things done. I think a really good project for a lot of folks in the academy to take on is to evaluate which states that had a trifecta used it better than others, more creatively, or got better results for it. In particular, there is healthy introspection going on right now on the left on the topic of how we may have gotten in our own way in terms of getting stuff done. The one that's provoked the most discussion, I think, from people like Ezra Klein and Matt Iglesias is around housing. But of course, transportation and clean energy projects, this is clearly something we got to look at too, right? There's a forthcoming analysis. I'm only in the first few pages, so I'm not identifying with myself with it until I actually read all of it. But Mark Dunkelman has a book coming out called Why Nothing Works, where he points to the fact that there are two different instincts in progressivism. One is to use, like you said, the liberal, what do you call it, the liberal collective promise?
Oh, I said the liberal promise that we can solve problems effectively collectively.
Yeah, so which of course implies using the tools of government to do stuff, right? And we're protecting people through government. When I do an airline regulation, it's to protect people through government. Because we know that there are things that make people unfree, like a corporation unchecked, and government can help. But of course, progressives also have an instinct to protect people from government. and steps that we've taken to make it harder to build certain things. We came by them honestly, especially when you think to the previous question about how transportation projects rolled over people's neighborhoods, right? We got to include those voices. But maybe we've, in the name of doing that, which we must continue to do, we've gotten in our own way in terms of actually delivering things. So that laboratories of democracy premise about what cities and states can do, I actually think is going to be wildly important, not just in quote unquote resistance, although I do think AGs and states and mayors sometimes standing up to Washington will be very important in the next few years, but in terms of just getting things done. And the good news is we have handed states and cities about $500 billion to use to get that done, which they're now fast underway in doing. And I think it'll bear a lot of fruit in the second half of this decade. It would have been politically convenient if it happened in the first half of this decade, but that's just how long these things work. So let's study who's doing it better than others and learn a lot from the people who are doing it right.
Thank you.
Great. Let's go up there.
Hi, thank you so much for being here, Secretary. I'm Liv. I'm a sophomore at the college and like a very proud Michigander, so we're very happy to have you.
Where are you from?
I'm from like the Detroit area.
Okay, great.
But I'm actually going up to Traverse City for New Year's, so hopefully I'll
it
see
is
you
the
around.
Did you know in Traverse City, sorry, this is where I live, it's the cherry capital of the world, just ask them. And we have a cherry
The
drop.
cherry drop,
The ball
yeah.
drop is just a big illuminated cherry. It's the cool.
It's awesome. In case anyone's wondering, it's awesome.
good.
But I was just wondering, as a Midwesterner, I mean, you obviously live in Michigan now and you grew up in Indiana. What's something that you think, now that you're like on a national stage, that you think the country can take away from the Midwest besides like venison jerky? Anything, any big lessons?
So I didn't realize I was that Midwestern until I got here.
Yeah.
Maybe you've had the same experience.
I felt the exact same, yeah.
If anything, I grew up a little bit in tension with my Indiana hometown. I didn't really realize I was from somewhere until I got here. And don't take this the wrong way, but the East Coast has a way of reminding you, if you're from a place like the Midwest, that cultural differences pertain within the United States in a big way. Just making eye contact and saying hi to people on the street and having them look at you like you're nuts.
I know, the
right?
Midwest nice.
And again, I'm an introvert. But yeah. So, you know, to abstract a little bit into political virtues, or at least public virtues, I think that universal virtues that are particularly prized in the Midwest include humility, decency, and honesty. Obviously, the incoming leadership could not more extravagantly be different in terms of style from those Midwestern qualities. But I do think when you go out in the world, those things really create a chance to connect with people. The other thing that's really interesting is you'll find places abroad that rhyme with the Midwest. When I became a student in the UK, I had an even more extreme culture shock going to regular England than I did in New England. Then I found out about Scotland. It's kind of like the Midwest of England. They got more industry and they like to fry things, and they make up for bad weather with cultural warmth. You begin to find these patterns. Anyway, I think the bigger point I might make in response to your question is, think about the things that make you a fish out of water wherever you are. But then remember that wherever you've just been will be part of what is your distinctiveness wherever you go. You're going to go back there, and you're going to be the Midwesterner who went to the East Coast to study. And who knows what you'll choose to do next. But those little reminders that you're from somewhere are good for you. And I hope you live into them.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Mark. I'm a first year at the college. I'm also from the Midwest, just from Southern Illinois, so it's a bit different. I grew up in a very different political environment than most people in Illinois, and very similar to how you might have grown up in South Bend. And I was introduced to you through your book, which was actually mentioned earlier, which I was very happy about.
Thank you.
And I wanted to thank you for writing this book, because it was really my introduction to American politics and to the idea of trust between parties, but between everybody in the U.S. And I really wanted to ask, ever since you wrote this book, is there anything that you would add or any advice that you would give on the basis of what you wrote in the book for anybody here or anybody who's doubting, as you had said, going into maybe public service after what has happened over the last 4 years or 4 days?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for picking up the book. I appreciate it. By the way, the first book I read with the word trust in the title was written by David King, who wrote Generation Trust in response to how 9/11 shaped my generation. Let me say this. One theme that was in the book that I think we need to spend a lot more time thinking about is how we get information. So you recall I wrote up a little bit these studies on vaccine misinformation and the fact that Russia didn't just push anti-vax message. Often what they would do is they would push an anti-vax message and a pro-vax message at the same people because the point was just to get you at each other's throats. And I think a lot of that's happened recently. Yes, they had a preferred presidential candidate. But their biggest objective wasn't to have for one side to win. It was to break down our trust. It turns out all the nuclear weapons in the world are not capable of doing what this information vector into our society did with shocking efficiency. And we're behind. I don't just mean like those who are on my side of the political spectrum are behind. I think America's behind. Here's something to think about in terms of trust. For the last 100 years, it's been possible to more or less decisively settle a question with photographic evidence, right? If you're trying to prove whether a thing happened or not, if you're trying to establish whether somebody's telling the truth or lying, in politics, in the courtroom, whatever, one of the best tools you could use to try to establish the truth was a photo. That's basically not true anymore, or it's about to be not true, right? The AI stuff is so sophisticated. We're kind of getting out of the period where already with the deep fakes and stuff, we're kind of graduating out of that. Now, on one level, that's terrifying because it's one symptom of the fact that right now we have never had more information and we've never been less informed, right? That's the result of the information bombardment we're living with and the having our news feed be decided by an algorithm instead of an editor, right? On the other hand, if that was true for the last 100 years, then that means it was not true for the thousands of years before the 1920s, right? So what do we do before that? I mean, we had signatures as a means of authentication. It's useful, not exactly impossible to defeat, right? But there were people who helped figure out what was a forgery and what was real in the 17th century, right? So we've got to be harder targets for this misinformation stuff. And we got to recognize that sometimes the misinformation that comes at us won't just be designed to attack a person, it will be designed to attack our trust itself. We just lived this in a huge way in Hurricane Helene response. And there's only a couple solutions I know of. One is to get things and people offline. Again, I think this is a mayor's instinct. You run into somebody at the dog park and they're the same person who is just horrible from behind a keyboard, but you're actually talking to them, they're not so bad. I did with Elon. I mean, I don't know if you followed this, like he texted this thing, or he tweeted this thing that wasn't true about the FAA, and I just asked him to call me, and then he did, and then we solved the problem. I'm under no illusions about the bigger picture, but that happens, right? So one is try to find people offline when they're better than when they're online. The other is to actually understand the dynamics of the information space. And this is a message I have in particular for young people who are ready to make yourself useful in the political and social life of this country. Because we've got to be harder targets. Look, I bet in the 17th century, if I was walking down Harvard Square, if we had a Harvard Square then, or outside of Massachusetts Hall, and somebody handed me a pamphlet that was printed on a printing press, I would have been pretty impressed. I would have been more inclined to believe it. Because not everybody has a printing press. This must be legit, right? And then over time, we became more sophisticated. I don't know if Gen Z even did. If you should find yourself reading a hard copy, well, you got my book. So if you find yourself reading a hard copy of Time Magazine or the New York Times or whatever, sometimes your eye falls on newsprint and it's designed to look like an article, but it's actually an ad. And it only takes your brain like half a second to realize it's an ad. You just have some pattern recognition that tells you, right? We don't have that at the same level on the digital stuff. And every time we form it, a new medium arises. we're going to have to figure out how to pick through that and really understand what's real and what's not real, right? That's the difference between the person who is correctly upset with the administration because we haven't solved their economic problem and the person who is happy with their economic circumstance but has been led to believe that unemployment is an all-time high in the United States of America, right? If we can at least be having politics over this, then it's over reality. And if we're getting dinged, it's because of something we actually got wrong. So I think those themes of trust and what we do in order to have access to the same reality matter more than ever. But I don't have the prescription, other than more time offline. And let me add one other thing, more circumstances that pull us offline. I think military service does this. I think any pattern of belonging that is not predicted by your political affiliation, that can be in a faith community, a neighborhood, a sports team, whatever. Find those, because those overlapping circles are really important. But the rest of it, not to put it back at you, is kind of what this generation is going to have to help us lead the way out of. Because my generation clearly can't figure it out.
Our generation, right?
Yeah.
Mr. Secretary, we're at time. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome home. Fabulous.
Appreciate it.